How you doing? Welcome back to Spiritual Judo for a Sustainable Jesus. I'm Mark Montero, your host. And so, here's this image from Florence, Italy, the Florentine Codex, about the smallpox. Let me see if I can move it off to the side there. Oh, there's the rather graphic image. Okay, so Nicasius of Rheims was made a saint and a Christian saint in some century because he's supposed to have survived smallpox. Didn't put the year down, so I'll have to look it up. 9th century, the Persian physician Rhazes made a fairly significant advance by distinguishing smallpox, variola, also called variola, from measles and chickenpox, right? And he wrote this book with this interesting title, Kitab fi al-Jadari wa al-Hazba, the book of smallpox and measles. How do you like my Arabic there? Salam alaikum. Now, the Crusades established variola in Europe, smallpox, where mortality went up to 30%. So then with it getting established in Europe, after the Crusades in whatever, the year 1000, the year 1100, the year 1200, 1000, then by 1509, already established in Europe, the Spanish colonizers brought it to the Amerindians for the first time. Joy, oh joy. But it was actually, of course, hardly merely a bioweapon. It was simply a scourge of Europe. In the 1700s, Europe, it was killing some 400,000 people per year. So the bioweapon option only was quite inadvertent in the beginning. Now, what made Europeans capable of using it as a bioweapon was this very interesting history of variolation and inoculation of smallpox, which has this quite significant history, which begins before Edward Jenner. The story of Edward Jenner is told in a very limited context. And it turns out that, because in fact it turns out that in 1400s China, they've been able to find the records, interestingly enough, that China had nasal insufflation techniques, like that term. So we would call it, blow the things up the nostril, blow nasal things up the nostril, dried scabs, not fresh. You hear? They dried scabs from mild case donors. They blew these up the nostrils of people, I think of young people, already beginning to think in terms of what we think of in terms of vaccination, in terms of causing the disease to develop resistance. All right, so they did some observing of the demographics of the disease. By 1700, the London Royal Society received a report from a British East India Company employee about Arab practices. No, that was China. Now, Arab practices were also noted to be occurring in Sudan. For example, the Dak el-Jedri, hitting the smallpox. That's an interesting thing you can look up, an interesting sort of practice they had that appears to have been passed along and then modified from the Chinese. And so as we get into modern times, in 1714 then, the transmission of the Arab practices in Turkey had led to the variolation technique of pus. an Italian physician, Dr. Emanuele Timoni of Constantinople, based in Constantinople, wrote a letter to the Royal Society in England, who published it in their Philosophical Transactions. It's a pustule technique. And then a lady, Mary Wortley Montagu, who had lost her brother and herself had survived scarred. She visited Turkey and observed elderly women performing the variolation, taking pus, right? So the pus then is already going to be an interesting kind of mix with the virus. So let me check the time here. How are we doing? All right, got a little bit of time still. So she had a 5-year-old son, and she had him variolated in the Turkish technique under the observation of Dr. Charles Maitland. And incidentally, she didn't tell her husband until a week later, and it was successful. Okay, so look at the human relations going on there. And then later in England, it was tested, somebody was having it tested at a prison and an orphanage. So in all those cases, it became quite demonstrated that it was quite a successful treatment. However, unfortunately, the fact that it was subject to parameters, right, and it needed to be analyzed carefully according to its component practices, sub-procedures, because a royal prince died when it was administered to him. So 1793, by 1793, variolation and inoculation had been so successful that John Haygarth published a sketch of a plan to exterminate the smallpox from Great Britain. That's how successful it was. And then, of course, Edward Jenner came up with his technique that was even more successful. Right? Apparently, there were certainly there were the side effects from this very strong disease. So cowpox was considered, in fact, to be milder. So a good start with a good transition then to the cowpox, and thanks to Edward Jenner and the interesting phenomena like the Bulmes expedition, something like that, from Spain, that sailed from Spain and transferred the technique of smallpox vaccination using cowpox to the Spanish colonies in the New World. Now, in the North American colonies, there was a whole other situation. So let me check the time here. Okay, I'm going to stop this segment. Thanks. Cheers. See you in a moment.